You to get food. This is good. Buen provecho. Bon appetit. We are really fortunate to have a great panel to finish off looking at Mexico, not just internal politics, which we've heard great presentations and discussion and back and forth this morning about what's going on inside of Mexico, both in terms of politics and economics as well as rule of law, but also looking at Mexico's role in the world. And what we have two great panelists here. What we asked them to do was think both vis-a-vis the United States, obviously of interest to those of us here in Washington, but also Mexico's broader role. And let me tell you something. You have the bios of the panelists, so I'm not going to repeat those. Carlos Heredia, needless to say, is now the director professor and director of international studies at CIDAC. He was previously a visiting scholar at ITAM. He's been a member of Congress. He served in the Mexico City government, one of the founding board members of Comexi, of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, and has played a number of other roles. But one of the things, Carlos has been a major thinker on foreign policy generally, and has also been working on Mexico's relationship with China as part of his work at CIDAC and ITAM. And so we'll talk a lot about the U.S.-Mexico relationship, I'm sure, which he's been active on for 20 or 30 years, but also has a different perspective on some of Mexico's other engagements in the world. Leon Krause is a fabulous radio commentator. He has written a book on the United States. He is one of the few people I know in Mexico who, La Casa Dividida, about the Bush presidency, for those that want to go out and find the book, La Casa Dividida. Leon is one of the few people I know in Mexico who both covers internal issues in Mexico, something he has to do a great deal for both his radio program and his television program, now on Foro TV, on Televisa Dos, but also is an expert in what's going on in the United States. He actually knows the United States very well. He's a master's from NYU. He wrote the book by doing a lot of research in the U.S. He contributes to a number of media, both in Mexico and the United States. If you follow the New Republic at all, he's frequently blogs on the New Republic website. He's written for the New Republic. And he has a side passion, which is for soccer, actually. So you'll occasionally see him writing about soccer out there. So maybe he'll find a way of weaving that into the conversation about Mexico's foreign engagements. But we have two people who have really a broad perspective on where Mexico is located and sort of pushing the debate on where Mexico is going in the world. So very pleased to have both of them with us. And when we finish, Luis, after we have a bit of a discussion, we'll close with a bit of a final commentary to try and bring all this together. But how do we have you on this? Carlos, do you want to go ahead and start? And then we'll go to Leon.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. And I want to thank the Mexico Institute, Andrew Selee, Eric Olson, and the whole team for the invitation. And I want to congratulate Luis Rubio for co-organizing CIDAC and the Mexico Institute this seminar. Thanks, Luis. I was going to give a title to my presentation, which was Mexican Foreign Policy in the Age of Wikileaks, because I've had the opportunity to discuss the Wikileaks issue with both Mexican diplomats and U.S. diplomats. And a few minutes ago, I went downstairs to make a phone call, and I ran into Paulo Sotero of the Brazil Institute, and he encouraged me to do so because there's a lot of meat there. And I said I would be discussing Mexican foreign policy, and he said, "Oh well, that doesn't include Brazil, because it only includes the United States." And that's part of our problem. I guess we took NAFTA 17 years ago as a point of arrival, that it would magically resolve and define Mexico's insertion in the world, Mexico's place in the world. And then we slept it off for almost 2 decades. And we found a world that is totally different to what it was in 1993, 1994, when I was crisscrossing the hallways of the U.S. Capitol talking to members of Congress about NAFTA. And we were in opposite sides of the table from Jaime. But it was a very fruitful conversation. But I bring this up because Mexico's place in the world is something that we don't often discuss in Mexico. The current administration started out saying that their goal was to bring more world into Mexico and more Mexico into the world, whatever that means. But it hasn't meant much because we believe that geography determines our place in the world, and that geography should be the only factor that determines our place in the world, and having a trade agreement with the largest economy in the world and sharing a 3,141 kilometers border then dictates everything else. And we now have a world in which other countries happen to play a major role, including, of course, not only the European Union, and Jaime has discussed that, and Japan, but also, again, China, Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and what they call middle-sized emerging countries like Turkey, for one, that is a key country, and India, of course, and we're beginning to come out of that long period of a siesta to reckon with the fact that we have to address a world that is quite different. Like Andrew mentioned, I served in the government of the state of Michoacán under Lázaro Cárdenas Batel, and we started sending students to China in 2004. Already about 110 students have gone to learn Mandarin in Fudan in Shanghai. You know that place. in the University of Language and Culture of Beijing. We have a major still working the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, owned by ArcelorMittal of India, which provides for another fruitful exchange. We went to Brazil to learn about what they're doing in Embrapa, Empresa Brasileira de Pesquisas Agropecuarias, that they're developing biotechnology in a very productive way. So I guess I'm also going to discuss in a few minutes that I have how Mexico's foreign policy has expanded to the states and municipalities. They call them new actors, but they're not really new actors. Maybe they're doing new things, but they've always been there. And that's a field that is wide open. How do Jalisco and Shanghai relate to each other? Or how do Bangalore and Monterrey discuss how you run a technology center? But in any event, the aim of Mexico's insertion in the world has been forced by the outside world upon us, rather than us having a clear idea of what we want to do with the rest of the world, mainly because we have been lagging behind. And I should add that the United States has also been lagging behind countries of the Asia-Pacific vis-a-vis almost any indicator regarding issues that POTUS addressed in this SOTU. So that means the President of the United States addressed in the State of the Union address. Central America is also a very important region for us. We had a seminar throughout the week at CIDAC in which a couple dozen consuls from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador gave us an earful, like we usually do to the United States, complaining about the treatment that our migrant workers get in the United States, well, let me tell you that you could say that the Border Patrol really pampers our migrant workers compared to what we do to Central American workers. So it was a very illustrating seminar, an eye-opener for many people who hadn't even looked on that issue. And at the end of the seminar, I suggested that we discuss an issue that Pedro Noyola brought up, the need to move towards labor mobility in North America, which of course in an atmosphere of fear, national security urgencies is probably the worst of times to bring up, and yet at the same time I think that we have to develop a vision, a strategic vision, a framework in which issues of the economy and issues of foreign policy are analyzed together. Otherwise, we're always going to discuss immigration as a criminal issue, as a police issue, as purely a security issue, and not as a vehicle to supplement our economies, to use the interdependencies, the synergies between our two economies and the three economies of North America, and outline a vision of what we want in the future. Brazil. Brazil is the object of our envy. Whenever you bring up the issue at our foreign ministry, faces of Mexican officials start getting, why do you have to bring up the issue of Brazil if we're better off in many indicators, including street violence and crime, and yet they get a lot of publicity and we don't? And I guess we've had a couple of seminars in Brazil, one at CIDAC, one with the Center for Latin American Studies of Harvard University in Mexico City as well. And I was talking to Paulo Sotero about, and we've talked to Andrew about that. When you take a snapshot, Mexico's still better off than Brazil in many indicators, that's true. But when you look at trends over time, and when you project those trends to the future, then Brazil has really gained much more ground than we have in the last few years. And this allows me to talk about what Diana Negroponte raised in her first question, the question of a provocateur, Mexico's feudal society. We have a feudal society in Mexico, yes we do. Brazil also does. And yet there is a sense of purpose that some 27, 30 million Brazilians were incorporated into a middle class and have some hope and aspirations for the future. Luis de la Calle and Luis Rubio just published a book recently in Mexico about the middle class in Mexico, how it has evolved. But there's a big question mark there because in spite of the figures showing that the Mexican middle class has been widening, the expectations of people, like many of our speakers have mentioned in the panel, in the different panels, are very gloom. You know, like people do not really think that that there is a promising economic situation in their future. Maybe because it's so intertwined with the violence, and especially if you ask people in Reynosa, if you ask people in Torreón, in Tampico, in Culiacán, they just cannot figure out how we're going to get out of this quagmire. Economic activity has been thwarted by violence, and there's no sense of how we're going to solve that. But let me go back to foreign policy and address Mexico-U.S. relations. I'm an atypical, untypical analyst of foreign policy because I've never worked for Mexico's Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores. Yet I have been in touch with our last 7 ministers to discuss issues very closely, and with the last 5 U.S. ambassadors. And I'm always puzzled about how we have so many conducts of dialogue. Everybody who served in the Mexican government know that they talk to their peers very often. You name the issue, attorney generals, customs officials, foreign ministers, presidents, and yet we have this extreme difficulty of defining what we can do together, jointly. We come up with a checklist. This is what the U.S. wants to do with Mexico. It's harder to come up with a list of what Mexico wants to do with the United States. But then when you try to mix, to combine those two and create synergy and say, what are we going to do together, things become much more complicated. We undertook a study on how to, on the management of the U.S.-Mexico border last year. And we've been talking to, you name it, every authority on both sides of the border. And pretty much what the conclusion is, we have to solve our own domestic problems before we even begin to think of a border that can be managed in a joint way. So the level of communication, the dialogue that our ambassador here has with lawmakers, with governors, with mayors, with the President of the United States, the dialogue that we have with the U.S. Embassy and with the many delegations that visit Mexico and all corners of the country, not only the capital, is very, that happens every day. We have a dialogue on an ongoing basis that would lead you to believe that we would be able to come up with a shared vision and to define what shared responsibility means in the war against organized crime, in economic integration, in immigration, but that's just not happening. Maybe it is too ambitious because the U.S. also has very severe problems, and it's also looking inward, in the aftermath of the economic downturn and trying to solve out, how to come out of that. And it's not a good time. It's never a good time to talk about relations with other countries when you're trying to solve your very own domestic severe problems. But I do believe that it's precisely in these times, in these trying times, that we have to come up with a vision and push forward. And I think that many officials in the Mexican government know that and are trying to do their share of the work, but we don't seem to be getting very far in that regard. Finally, I'm going to put forward another provocation. I think that, as Pedro mentioned, NAFTA is no longer the framework that we need for the world our part of the world in 2011. That we need to think of North America as a productive platform vis-a-vis Asia, vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and that integration requires a new vision in which we acknowledge the degree of integration of markets here in terms of trade, in terms of labor mobility, a de facto integration that is not acknowledged by the governments, a very complicated, difficult, excruciating integration though, but it is there. And I think that we need that vision if we are, as countries and as a region, to play a relevant role in the years to come. The fact that the U.S. economy enjoys an edge over other countries has a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. labor force is supplemented by the workers that come from the Mexico, Central America, Caribbean region. Our elites in Mexico are very, or have been, detached from many conflicts in Mexico because we have had the escape valve of immigration to the United States. In recent years that has become more complicated. But when we hear, well, you know, that's not going to fly in the U.S. Congress, that's not going to fly with the administration, that's not going to fly with the American public, I think that we have to strengthen our, our critical thought and come up with a vision that lays out what the future is bringing and will mean for our two countries, for our economies. A final word on how the bilateral relationship is seen in a very different way depending on where you're standing. I have been working with Mexican migrant workers for a number of years, and I always ask them, are you in favor of closer economic relations with the United States, a further economic integration? And, you know, in a overwhelming majority, they jump and say, of course I am. We need that. You guys figure it out. You do what you have to do. You talk to academics in the U.S., you talk to politicians, you talk to lawmakers, because that's the future. Whether we admit it, recognize it, acknowledge or not, it is happening. We have integration on an everyday basis, around the clock, and they have a lot of common sense, and they say that's what we need. But trouble comes when we get to to deal with our institutions on both sides of the border, and it suddenly becomes excruciatingly difficult. We have many students in the room. I talked to Arturo Borja, one of our affiliated professors at CIDAC, and asked him, Arturo, why is it that Mexico only has 12,000 graduate students in the United States, and South Korea, which is 6,000 miles away, has 80,000. Why? And he, of course he has been asked that question many times, and he says, well, I guess because South Korea has a strategic program, a systematic program that includes parents, students, authorities, schools, and say we need to send our kids to get the best graduate education in the world that you still can find in the United States. And they have a national urgency to do that. They use their lifetime savings to do that. And Mexico doesn't have that kind of urgency. And we don't do it as a school system. We don't do it as a country. We don't do it as a university system. And we should also have many, many, many more U.S. American students in Mexico to get to know Mexico. Mutual knowledge can only come when our two peoples, beyond our elites, really, really get to know each other. The people that know how hardworking, dedicated Mexican workers are, always want them back. They say, I've hired people from Michoacan over the last 15 years. They've been extremely good in delivering. I want them back. So I want our two governments to open up the channels for legal ordered flow of labor between our two countries. But as one of the Mexican newspapers put it, somebody asked an analyst, what do you think of Secretary Clinton's 6-hour visit to Guanajuato? And he replied, well, she didn't solve drugs and organized crime in Mexico, so it was a failure. So, of course, the U.S. is not going to do for us what we don't do for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. I neglected to mention, Carlos, by the way, is a member of the advisory board of the Mexico Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, as is Luis Rubio and Diana Negroponte. So great to have you here. And Leon, look forward to your comments.
This is going to be a good follow-up to your piece, I think. Well, it's been a truly fascinating morning for me, and I thank the Wilson Center and CIDAC for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. My fellow participants all morning long, and I'm the last one, so have laid out in great detail all the things that should be done in Mexico, everything from opening key sectors of the economy to foreign investment, to widening the fiscal base, or maybe finding a way to get independent candidates into electoral process in Mexico. And no one talked about education, thank God, because then we would have had to stay here for a couple of days. Unfortunately, all of that seems very unlikely. Why? Because the incentives, the political and the electoral incentives just aren't there. And what's more important, public pressure just isn't there either. Why? Well, because of the way public opinion is shaped. Since I'm a journalist and not a scholar, the only one in the panel, by the way, I thought I would share some thoughts on the role of the media now and the role of the media in the future, not only in Mexico, where the media haven't really played a very constructive role when it comes to building up our democracy, but especially when it comes to shaping future debate in our bilateral relationship and what I think most important, public understanding with a capital U of one another. Let me start with a personal anecdote. It happened a few years back on what was my first assignment of many as a reporter for a not-so-sorely missed Mexican magazine, which shall remain nameless. The editor thought we needed a piece on migrants in New York, especially the large community from Puebla that has made New York its home for a while now. The editor had heard of that conditions for the Poblano community had worsened severely and felt that it was urgent for the magazine to capture what was for him an apocalyptic narrative, with some sort of biblical undertones, and with a big beard, by the way, that he had. He told me to go find what he described as the epicenter of modern slavery. Queens, El Barrio in Harlem, and so on. Curiously enough, I flew to New York, and curiously enough, that's where I first met now Ambassador Sarukan, who was Mexico's consul in New York. I remember quite well when I explained my mission to Sarukan. He frowned, as he sometimes does, and let's be honest, and basically explained that I would find no such thing as modern slavery in New York. Sure, I could talk to the kids being held in Rikers Island, which I did, but even there I would not find the doomsday scenario my editor wanted. Sure, I could talk to the street vendors in El Barrio and hear of police abuse. I did, and they did pass along some crazy stories. But even there I would find that the community had worked together to sign a petition that had resulted in changes, and effective changes at that. What I ended up finding in New York is what I then found in Los Angeles, Arizona, Alabama, Chicago, and the other places where for a long while I reported on migration, something I miss very much. A very complex, sometimes infuriating, but many other times touching, a story of flux, common identities, and a sort of syncretic vortex that I found and still find fascinating. A new nation was being born in New York, and as it has in so many other places. I particularly remember, I'll share just one of many, but just one, particularly remember the story of the owner of a store in Astoria. I just happened to walk in because I wanted to see the colors on the shelves of a Mexican store in New York, something that, apart from an Indian store, it's the best, beautiful. Turns out she had arrived without any papers 18 years before, carrying a baby boy in her arms and following a husband who led her successfully through the desert. She had endured a very difficult first 10 years in New York, very difficult, struggling to make enough, only to make enough to live with dignity. But meanwhile, her kid went to school, learned English. She did as well, and so did her husband. After 15 years in America, she had managed to set up shop right there in Queens, the epicenter of modern slavery. She then had another baby, a girl. Just then, right at that moment, her son walked in. He hardly spoke Spanish and wanted to become an Air Force pilot. He had never gone back to Mexico, and he didn't want to go back to Mexico. Not because of resentment, but because his life, as that of many there and that of millions in previous similar migrations, not only to the United States but all over, his life was no longer in Michoacán, where he came from, but in New York. Not in his original homeland, but in his adopted homeland, the real homeland. He was a citizen of the United States, and a proud one at that. Their story of this family, and we again could talk of many other stories. I found many recently when talking to students who were fighting for the approval of the DREAM Act. Their story was not of slavery, but of vibrant struggle. Story shared by migrants, as far as history can recall. Goes without saying that my editor wasn't very pleased when I told him I hadn't really found a plantation in the middle of Brooklyn. But to be fair, it's not right to blame my editor, and here is where I share, as I do many of Carlos's arguments, especially the final part of his presentation. It's not even fair to blame others who insist on the same analogy nowadays, tempted by the comfort of generalization, how comfortable generalization is. It's a common theme among Mexican pundits and an even more recurring narrative among the Mexican public. The migrants are heroes, and all the pinches gringos just abuse them in every possible way and every possible scenario. That's what happens when one posits a question, for example, to the audience, to a radio audience about Mexico and the United States on the radio or on TV. Absolute, instant, and irrational fury fueled by ignorance, a common enemy. It's hard to think of another bilateral relationship in the whole world as deeply important and at the same time rooted in such ignorance as this one. And I am talking of the many levels, but especially the public, the general public, that very somewhat important part of our bilateral relationship. I am obviously not talking of people in this room, but of people who watch TV or listen to talk radio every day, the people who answer polls and in the end move a country, move a democracy, or don't move a country or a democracy, as it sometimes happens in Mexico. Not only do we not know the neighboring country, we absolutely ignore the way their political system really works. If someone were to ask me how many Mexicans, and even Mexican foreign policy wonks or pundits like the one you quoted, can explain how what role Karl Rove had in George W. Bush's presidency, who are the Blue Dog Democrats, how many justices are sitting in the Supreme Court, who is John Roberts, why the NRA holds so much power, or why Sarah Palin is still relevant, I would have some fingers to spare, and when it comes to the Palin question, I would have both hands to spare. The same is true here, this ignorance, and that is a shame and the origin, in my opinion, of many of our deeply rooted misunderstandings. It's hard to have an intelligent discussion on migration when most people think in Mexico that Barack Obama, Chucho said, snap of the fingers, I chose the magic wand, has a magic wand with which he could pass legislation tomorrow. And it, of course, works both ways. I don't have to look at polls to know that people here don't have a clue of what Mexico is going through right now. Let me go further. I'm sure that if we were to ask Congress for a detailed opinion, many Congress men and women, I would say most, but I want to be polite, simply couldn't explain a thing and won't go into the same rhetorical path that is rooted not only in ignorance, but, in my opinion, something far worse, a sort of irresponsibility shared, as I said, in both sides of the border. If Mexican ignorance of the United States interests and political dynamics and even national ethos is something shameful, so is American unwillingness to understand what really happens in Mexico. And I'm not only talking of security, I'm talking, for example, of the social dynamics of the many communities where migrants come from, the famous comunidades expulsoras. If Americans saw those places with their women as modern Penelopes, waiting for men who take decades to come back, or children who only know their fathers from a weekly phone call to the municipal phone booth, then public opinion here might shift. Ignorance works both ways, and its consequences have been severe and are now becoming, in my opinion, disgraceful and dangerous, as we saw with the last election cycle here. Let me propose a solution, a romantic one maybe, but a solution. The media have to play a bigger and better role in shedding light on the nature not only of the bilateral agenda, but also, crucially, the history and current reality of both countries. This is not an easy endeavor. Mexican audiences, for example, are intensely provincial. I can tell you that every time one addresses international affairs on national television, ratings drop instantly. It's really horrible to see minute-by-minute ratings when one talks about international affairs. It happened to me last Tuesday after the State of the Union, although, to be fair, talking about Paul Ryan at length wouldn't generate that many viewers here either. But the ratings drop has more to do with the way Mexican audiences have been educated or uneducated as viewers. I recently worked for a guy, and this is absolutely true, he shall remain nameless as well, but my resume is available online. I recently worked for a guy who used to say that 1,000 people killed in Africa equaled 100 killed in Europe, equaled 10 killed in the United States, equaled 10 killed in Mexico, equaled 1 killed in Mexico City. That's the kind of nonsense that rules information priorities. That's the way he explained the way one should build the priorities in the radio newscast or television newscast. It was radio, by the way. That's the kind of nonsense that rules information priorities in Mexican media and naturally dictates the depth and knowledge of Mexican audiences, and that has got to change. It did a few months back. I'm proud to report that last November's election was covered in real time with a 4-hour special on one of Mexico's main channels. It was a midterm election, so no presidential sexiness available. I was proud of that, and even more proud when I saw the messages on Twitter and Facebook. People were interested. People understood things about America they didn't know before. For a moment, America became understandable, and much more important, became, however fleetingly, less a villain than a complex partner that one has to understand in order to achieve any progress. What about the ratings? Well, they weren't that good, but they weren't that bad either. The whole episode led me thinking about the future, and with this I wrap up, about the future not of Mexican-American diplomatic relations, which are very important and I respect very much, but something far more important, in my opinion, public perception of each other, public knowledge of each other. What if Hispanic media in the States, Mexican media back home, and of course American networks made an effort and tried to explain one country's reality to the other? Not only emphasizing citizenship and participation in the census, both of which are deeply important here, but also knowledge of a country that is inexorably linked to this one. The same, of course, applies to Mexican media in the United States. If all this happened, maybe a young reporter wouldn't be sent here to find out about modern slavery, that migrants are not heroes nor slaves, that there are nuances, like in every massive migration in history, like I said. Maybe then people here would really be outraged when the faces of migrant workers appear on a political ad as shameless electoral bait, presented as criminals, one and all. Once again, the comfort of generalization. Maybe then they would think twice before rejecting the DREAM Act for kids like the one I found in Queens, who wanted to be an Air Force pilot for this country, not for Mexico, though we do need Air Force pilots back there. Or maybe people here would realize what actually happens when dogmatic defense, I respect it very much, but dogmatic defense of the Second Amendment translates into wholesale shopping for cartels that kill 15,000 people next door. In the case of both our countries, mutual knowledge, not ignorance, would really be bliss. Thank you.
We'd like to open it up to discussion. We have a few minutes left here. We'll probably run till about 2:10, 2:15 for those that are checking their clocks. Gentleman here. Gentleman in pink shirt and blue suit.
Hi, my name is James Stranko, and I'm a master's candidate at SAIS. And I really appreciate your comments, both Carlos and Leon. I've just come back from a year in Mexico on one of the sort of official programs with Comexis and the Fulbright Commission, so I can speak a lot to what you're saying, and I can attest to a lot of what you're saying being true. One of the trends that I wanted to ask about, though, was in the past year and a half, you've heard of Calderón launching the effort to Hablemos Bien de México. And at the same time, if you want to talk about soccer, we heard about the incident with Aguirre in Spain and that bad word he used about what Mexico is right now. And I wanted to ask, one of the things that for me struck me as the most positive thing about life in Mexico is that no matter what sector of society you deal with, everybody has a link and a connection to the United States. Nearly everybody has a family member. Nearly everybody has somebody that's worked there or they've worked there themselves. But then you come to the U.S., and a lot of times you get Mexicans that speak very, very negatively about their own country. And that's something you definitely see a contrast with Brazil, if we want to talk about Brazil as a comparative case. Can you speak a little bit to why that happens and what type of sort of very low-level public diplomacy efforts can be done to rectify that? Thank you.
Anyone else have a burning question before we go back to Carlos and Leon? Everyone has been left speechless. Okay, you guys.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks, James, for your question. I asked that question to a person you may know, or some of you may know, Antonia Hernandez, a woman who was the leader of MALDEF years ago. And she came up with an answer that was very revealing to me. And she said, people born in Mexico who live and work here, or who are second-generation Mexicans, we do not, I'm quoting her, we do not speak badly of our country. We love our country, we love the history, the food, the music, the culture, and so forth. We speak badly about the political system, the reasons that expelled us from our country and that have not been addressed, and because that continues to happen. And in a way, we also speak, or we criticize politicians in Mexico who, after they couldn't care less about their own countrymen and women who have to leave because of economic hardships, have the nerve to still tell them, you have to be our ambassadors in the United States after we expelled you, and you speak highly of Mexico. And it may not be the same, but it's similar when it comes to Mexicans who live in Mexico and go outside and speak in a very critical way about our own country. Again, if you live, and I'm going to quote the same cities because I know those cities quite well, Tampico, Reynosa, Torreón, Durango, Culiacán. If you live there, and I notice I didn't even mention Ciudad Juárez, then it's really, really, really an uphill battle to be optimistic about not the future, the present. Places that have been taken over by organized crime. Jorge Montaño, who has long served in Mexico's foreign service and was ambassador to Washington, had a piece in El Universal a couple weeks ago. Because you know that at the beginning of the year, Mexican ambassadors and consuls meet in our foreign ministry, and they always get the marching orders of, speak highly of Mexico, send a positive message around, and I think they all should do that, and we all should do that. But at the same time, we cannot put aside what is really happening in many places of our country. And yet, Jorge Castañeda and Héctor Aguilar Camín have been crisscrossing the country and speaking to different audiences, and they came to the conclusion that our country is in a much better situation that most Mexicans are prepared to acknowledge. Of course, they don't live in those cities that I mentioned. So you find, like in every other country, you find bright spots, you find very dark spots, and I guess since you're a Fulbright student, you've been familiar with that discussion. Our countries are so intertwined, so intimately linked, and not only across the border, but I was an exchange student in Minneapolis when I was 14, and then this young student from Minneapolis came to Tampico, and he stayed for the summer of '71, and at the end of the summer he said to me and to my parents, "I have the solution for Mexico." What is the solution for Mexico? And he told us, adopt the American way of life.
It's a very interesting question. I do think that in many things, people who criticize Mexico and young people who are saddened by Mexico are right. When one has to deal with the news every day, I can tell you that there are some days that you start to somewhat lose hope, because you look around and you analyze the different subjects. You think about security, the judicial system, you think about education, and really there are not that many bright spots. And when you go, you leave the capital and you really visit, not in quick visits, but you really visit the states that Carlos mentioned, then you realize that at that level it's even more difficult. So in many ways, I think they're right. There's the inescapable reality. But it needs to be said also that, for example, in the media, it's also become fashionable to be negative. And I know some colleagues of mine that would really kill me for saying this, because I have one of them who says, I'm a journalist, not a Democrat, which means I don't care about the common good. I don't think of Mexican common good when I do my work. I'm just a reporter. The informative act is first and foremost, and who cares about the consequences? That's frivolous, in my opinion, when a country is going through what Mexico is going through right now. And of course, there's the other part. We are sometimes the Mexican punditry and Mexican audiences. We just go into Twitter, Mexican Twitter, and whew, you'll see. It happens here as well. It's lazy. Mexican punditry sometimes is lazy. We tend to generalize. And we have lived in a polarized society politically for a while now, which is a big factor, a big factor. And a terrible one at that I think has obviously also affected, not ours, but America goes through the same thing right now and has for a while. And that's terrible, no? For the political landscape to be polarized instead of things being decided in a moderate middle is very sad. And it's a sickness, a true illness, I think. And Mexico, with a very young teenage democracy, as Jesús said, has that illness. And it's not the right age to have that illness, no? And that's what I think.
Wow, now hands have gone up. So let's take a round. Dolia, Allison, you, and then we will, and then here, let's take a full round, actually, and then we'll come back for the final words here from the panelists.
Okay, I'm Dolia Stevens, and my first name is to both panelists. Carlos, you mentioned you were going to talk about Wikileaks, but you did not.
That's your job.
No, I wanted to know, from your standpoint, being in Mexico, I've been writing about Wikileaks about the subjects I cover, which is U.S.-Mexican relations. But I wanted to find out what's your estimate for that? Do you value the information that was released? Did it have any impact in Mexico over public opinion, in the relationship? What's basically your assessment? And in terms of what Leon Krause was saying, a the Mexican public opinion not being interested in international affairs, much less on African affairs, I guess, and bilateral affairs or U.S. affairs. Certainly, I mean, there's a rating there. I happen to report from Washington. I've been reporting for 21 years, and I have always found interest on what I stand in terms of, I mean, so you can qualify that lack of interest. But nevertheless, has Wikileaks increased in any way the interest on covering more or knowing more on this bilateral relationship, which in many ways the documents that Wikileaks has released on the U.S.-Mexico relation have been, if not extremely news, a lot of confirmation, different view, more direct, very updated on what the U.S. Embassy at least is thinking about the situation in Mexico.
Let's keep the round going. You had your hand up here, then we'll go to Allison over here, and there was someone else with their hand in your hand up. We'll do all 4 questions together, and those will be the final questions. Allison.
Oh, okay. I'm Allison Rand. I work for Center for Development and Population Activities, and this is more for Leon, but if Carlos has feedback as well. I have done a decent amount of research on migration and Mexican immigration to the U.S., and one thing that I looked comparatively at was the Instituto de Mexicanos en el Exterior here in the U.S. and the support that the Instituto provides for Mexicans living in the U.S. And based on what you said, Leon, about your editor wanting you to come back with a slave story and coming back with almost more of a, story of vibrant struggle, but more of a positive thing. Do you think that there's any way that the Instituto de Mexicanos en el Exterior could get involved in, some way in the increase in knowledge and, that type of work that you were talking about that the media needs to be more of a part of? Could there be any collaborative efforts between the media and the Instituto?
Can you pass the microphone across the way here?
Hi, my name is Katia Garcia. I'm actually from Mexico. I'm from Monterrey. I moved here 6 months ago. I'm doing a fellowship program. And right now you were mentioning that a lot of Mexicans in the United States talk badly about Mexico. I would never dare to speak in a negative way about Mexico, but something that they were just commenting, and it really frustrates us, is that 5 years ago, Monterrey, where I come from, was considered one of the safest cities in Latin America. And right now, I just got an email. One of my friends' grandfather was killed. And it's heartbreaking to see how the place you love is falling apart. So whatever, and this goes out to everyone. I do think that a lot of the media is involved in this, because you turn on the TV or you open the newspaper and everything is negative, instead of trying to make a balance. So we as Mexicans are also the ones we're creating the snowball effect, that we bring out this negative news, and then, the other newscast or whatever will print it, and the only thing I can say is I do think this is just a question. How do you think the media could do something about all those reporters that are just saying, well, that's my job, I'm just doing a job? I mean, if you really have ethics in your company, I think those people shouldn't be there, because they're the image of Mexico.
Thanks. And can you pass the microphone across here? You've been very patient. Thank you.
Ann Wakefield from Mexicanal. I'm wondering if any of you can comment on the role of class, the role that class has to play in the way that migrants perceive and talk about Mexico here. I think we hear mainly criticism from lower socioeconomical level Mexicans that had come here because they couldn't even find work, from peasant classes, lower level classes, but increasingly we're having more middle class migrating to the U.S., Mexican middle class migrating, and I think their perception of Mexico and the way they talk about Mexico is very different.
Thank you. Let's go back to the panelists. We had a request. Dolia's question was not heard by the people in the overflow room. There's actually an overflow room upstairs. Greetings to everyone up there, and greetings to everyone on the webcast. Dolia had asked about WikiLeaks and whether there's anything new and interesting for a Mexican audience, as well as ramifications. That's a brief summary, but let's go back to Carlos and Leon, and then we'll turn it back to any of the other panelists who want to add something. And then we have the privilege of having Luis Rubio say a few final comments before we end here today. Haven't had a chance to hear from him at length yet. So,
Dolia, on your question about WikiLeaks, I've read in detail many of the cables, and I've asked around, and I think the response from many Mexicans is that the content of the cables is quite accurate. And it is what politicians, both in the U.S. or officials, government officials, both in the U.S. and in Mexico, talk privately. In fact, I even read a quote, and I don't know, maybe somebody can ratify or rectify this quote, in which Secretary Clinton, right after the first leak, the first major leak, assembled her team and, organized a crisis room and, and told her staff, we have to come up with a strategy. And one of her staffers told her, "Oh, Madam Secretary, you should read what we say about you. That is not in the cables." So the reaction that I've heard is that what the content, again, it corresponds with a professional body of diplomats that is collecting information through whatever means and describes what they see. Maybe with a slant, maybe with a bias, maybe with whatever, but the content has not been disputed, except in some cases in which the outcome of that information may be harmful to individuals or may threaten collaboration between the government of the United States and other governments. I think one very contentious issue is the role of the Mexican military in the war against drugs and against organized crime, because they are depicted as non-reliable and that the Navy is reliable. And that is a very, very touchy issue, whether the military can trust the U.S. ambassador again and can continue working with him or not, which is what you wrote about. I don't have an answer for that, but what I think about is that we've only started, getting it's still a very small percentage of the cables, so we don't know what's coming, in the next few months. But what I remember from the first round of revelations was what I think Secretary Gates said. The countries of this world either fear us, respect us, or need us. So they will have to continue working with us. Next question. On the IME. Again, I am familiar with many members of the Consejo Consultivo Advisory Council of the IME and with the Directors General of the IME. And I think many of them do fantastic work. They link up the Mexican community to the cities and states where they live. They manage to have access to state assembly members, to members of Congress, and so forth. And last night we were talking about a program that is called the Network of Talents, which is highlighting the work that Mexicans who live and work in the United States are doing, coming up with new proposals, new discoveries, practical proposals to do in business, in science, in technology, and so forth. Maybe it becomes, rather a fuzzy issue because in Mexico we love to abandon our own people until they triumph in the United States. We have an astronaut from NASA, Jose Hernandez, whose parents hail from La Piedad, Michoacán. And again, they had to leave the country because of the economic hardships. He grew up in California, went to school here, and was trained as an engineer at NASA. And then we invite him to go back to Michoacán as the prodigal son and say that he's el astronauta michoacano. We take credit for it. So, that's the kind of contrast that you find. But I want to commend the work that IME does, and I want to commend the work that the Advisory Council of IME do, because I think it's very, very important work. In fact, many of our Central American migrant workers tell us, please continue doing the work you're doing because we use it, because it's very useful for us. Las ventanillas de salud, the many programs that the Mexican consulates have, and have the involvement of IME and of other agencies of Relaciones Exteriores, are extremely, extremely useful, and I commend that work. Katia, Monterrey. I didn't mention Monterrey. It was deliberate that I didn't mention it. But unfortunately, I'm sorry about the news that you just got. It's one of the everyday fears. When I get a phone call from Tampico, I just try not to think about that. Monterrey was one of the safest cities. I attended a meeting in Mexico City in November that was moved from Monterrey to Mexico City because people abroad either didn't have the clearance to go to Monterrey from their embassies, or were afraid to go to Monterrey. Ironically, many people from Tampico have fled to Monterrey because they don't know them there, and they can live incognito in Monterrey and escape from the threat of being kidnapped in Tampico or being extorted in Tampico. But it's really like you mentioned. I think you gave an accurate description, which leads me to the next question. And many people from Monterrey and Tamaulipas, upper middle class, have moved to San Antonio, only to mention one of the cities where they have fled to. And many of them transport to San Antonio all their virtues and vices. So they want to deal with people who do, who toil in their gardens, who wait at their tables in the same way that they deal with them in Mexico, in our feudal society. So they transport all their prejudices. They also transport their virtues, of course. But that's another window. A friend of mine emailed me the other day. You cannot believe the degree of racism that we have in San Antonio from our upper-class elites who have moved here and believe that they still are where they used to live and treat our own people miserably. So, again, I don't want to badmouth my own country, but
Menos mal.
but Carlos Monsiváis, the late Carlos Monsiváis, used a phrase that I think in this case applies and suits very well. I don't criticize them, I just describe them. Now, on a bright point, I think that many, and Laura knows about this, many human rights groups, many civil society organizations, many journalists, academics are trying to build networks to counter all this. I think the work that they're doing is very, very important. And I think that there are many dedicated government officials that are also doing a good job. Of course, that doesn't get to the front page as often as we would like to. But I can tell you that there are more people doing good work by large numbers than those that are ruining the lives of many Mexicans across the country. And I, for one, think that it is our responsibility to work in a positive, constructive way to build a present for ourselves and a future for our kids. And I don't think that in the end we will have a wrecked country. I think we have to react to the current situation. Many people are doing that, and I commend those who are even those who are doing it abroad. I think they are people who are an example of many Mexicans that are very dedicated in what they do and trying to do things well. Finally, if you allow me 1 second, Andrew, I think that the work that the Mexico Institute is doing and the Wilson Center is doing is absolutely crucial for this. So I want to commend the effort that the Mexico Institute and that CIDAC did this morning, and I think we need a lot more of this. Thank you.
And for that, let me thank the board of the Mexico Institute, which has actually come up with a lot of the ideas, as well as Miguel, who you've seen running around, who put together a lot of this meeting today, as well as Sarah and Dana, by the way. Leon, you have a...
Really quickly. Yeah. Of course, Wikileaks sells well with Mexican audiences. It's a meaty topic, and one must say that it's a particularly interesting one in Mexico, because the stuff that has been disclosed is serious business, as opposed to what was revealed in other places. I mean, Sarkozy, a narcissist.
Who knew, right?
I mean, it's funny. Gaddafi's Swedish nurse was a surprise. But in a more serious note, apparently, it is serious business, and the relationship, I think, has been potentially, not seriously, but harmed our bilateral relationship. So that's something to take into account. But once I agree, IME's efforts are wonderful. They do a great job. When it comes to narrative and to sharing success stories, it's difficult. As a journalist, I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but especially Mexican ones, it's almost impossible to talk frankly with diplomats in Mexico. they are always protecting themselves. With this transmigrant, this outrage that has been happening in Mexico with the Central American migrants, the way they're abused, and 6 of every 10 Central American women that go through Mexico are raped. This sort of outrage, one asks them, the Mexican authorities and diplomats, what are we doing? I mean, let's really be frank. And they say, well, we're really working, and it's impossible to talk to them. It's really difficult. So to find a narrative through the government when it comes to success stories is difficult. And lastly, about journalists, I wouldn't fire any reporter who reports on the stories. I mean, what I would love to see is less frivolity, less love of the easy rating success when it comes to TV. I know that that blood sells, but it's really sad to see that happening more often in Mexican TV, some places more than others. What I would call for is just for responsibility, moderation, but never censorship, because that goes against the kind of country I think we're trying to build. No? And yes, thank you, Wilson Center.
Leon, Luis, so pleased to have you here and to have worked with you on this, and you have the final word.
Thank you, Andrew. It's late, so let me just touch on 2 very quick points. Mexico has changed quite dramatically over the last 30 years, and that's true of its economy, it's true of its political system. And it has yet to consolidate its development on both grounds. It's not. It's a job in progress. Sometimes it appears it's backtracking, but it's a totally different environment from what existed 2 or 3 decades back. At the same time, the world has been changing, particularly as it pertains to the areas of crime, organized crime, quite radically. The drug market has changed. The organized crime in areas like pirated goods, like cheap goods being smuggled from China and other places, have created a new reality for which the Mexican polity was never prepared, but certainly it's not prepared today. And the clash between the two has created many of the things that we discussed this morning. It has rendered very many complex situations for which both Mexico and the U.S. are paying a big price, and many things that need addressing in Mexico have to go through Washington or through the U.S., and vice versa. Many of the things that the U.S. is facing need to go through Mexico. We heard that on the political arena, on the bilateral arena, and certainly on the economic arena. And that's why I think this has to be an ongoing conversation. The plan that Andrew and I thought of a few months back for this first session had to do with building or developing a conversation about what's going on. There are no conclusions. There are simply the problems that have to be seen, understood, and hopefully begun to be tackled. Thank you very much.